Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Valerie Nesbitt, and it is my honor and my privilege to introduce to you today Dr. Andrew Large. Dr. Large is the Canadian National-Pratt-Grinstad Professor Emeritus in Information Studies at McGill University. There'll be a quiz after. As well as being on faculty, Dr. Large has served as the Director of the School of Information Studies and also as Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Students in the Faculty of Education. Dr. Large's research interests lie in the area of information-seeking behavior and information technology, especially working with children. And he's going to speak to us today about his long and illustrious career with experiences in working with children. So,
okay, thank you. Thanks, Val, and thanks, Heidi, for inviting me to Buffalo for my second time. That's why the audience is so small. I have spoken here before. As Val says, I've chosen today, I've opted today to talk about the research that we've been doing for about 20 years, a little bit over 20 years, focusing on children, information behavior, and information technology. Of course, I've done other kind of research. Actually, for the first 13 years of my academic life, I didn't do research concerning children at all. I mean, I did other things. But I became interested in children at the beginning of the 1990s through an interest in interface design and interface use, itself stimulated by this plethora of CD-ROM products. CD-ROM was then a major way in the information world of delivering information. And CD-ROMs, for the first time in our field, enabled designers to produce really quite innovative, interesting, and very different one from another interfaces. So we became, back when I was in Wales, became interested in interface design. And so when I arrived at McGill, I was still interested in interfaces, and I wondered, how would children who now are beginning to encounter CD-ROMs in schools, how would they actually find the information? How would they cope with the retrieval devices that were made available to them? And would in a sense, the fun of the chase, the fun of finding the information, the challenge of finding the information via the interface, would that actually detract from the learning experience? Would the end become actually finding the information, not that as a means to actually reading the information and acquiring the information? So that was my starting point. And I had a colleague, Jamshid Beheshti in the school, who was interested in IT. And I said, are you interested in coming in on this grant, Jamshid? And he said, yes, he was. And so ever since we've worked together. So, Jamshid could have been here giving the talk as well as me. We've collaborated over 20-odd years, and I always say we never had an argument. We also met somewhat serendipitously through chasing money for something else. We met a young assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology called Alain Breleux. And Alain said he was interested also in CD-ROMs. He was interested in the ability of CD-ROMs to deliver animation to children, something, of course, that a printed encyclopedia had never been able to do. So we said, okay, why don't you join the team? So the three of us applied for a research grant and got the money, and we began our work. So the overall project was related really to CD-ROMs and learning, although learning is a word we've used a lot and never really quite worked out how do we measure learning. But anyway, it was in the realm of learning. But more specifically, it had two focuses. One was to look at retrieval and whether retrieval impacted upon recall. Not recall in information retrieval sense, but recall in the sense of would children be able to recall what they had just read or looked at. And then we were interested in animation, and did the addition of animation to a text or text and still images, did that facilitate greater recall? So those were the two research issues for us. And we went out and recruited 120 students, which I don't know whether it sounds a lot to you or not. It is quite a big number, actually, and many people were working with smaller numbers of students. In those days, 20-odd years ago, it seemed easier for us anyway to find children, so we had very little problem in collaborating with 4 schools to get these 120 students. They were grade 6 just for various pragmatic reasons made us opt for grade 6 students. We selected in the end 4 texts for them to read under 5 conditions. So we had children look at the printed encyclopedia articles, the encyclopedia articles printed plus illustrations, the CD-ROM text, the CD-ROM text plus illustrations, and finally the CD-ROM text, the illustrations, and animation. And we spent quite a bit of time selecting those texts. We chose an encyclopedia which had the same content, same textual content online on the CD-ROM, rather, and in the print, which was, I believe, I mean, I haven't looked back, I think it was Compton's Multimedia Encyclopedia, it was called. And we looked at the reading levels of the articles because we wanted to choose articles that were reasonably appropriate for grade 6 kids, 11 and 12 years old. We also were interested in a couple of other conditions being present, the complexity or the simplicity of a text. So we thought we might find differences according to the complexity of the text. So we had a way of measuring complexity which was abstracted from the actual vocabulary of the article. We had a way of measuring the semantic complexity of articles. So we chose one that was relatively simple, two that were relatively simple, and two that were complex. And we're also interested in the type. There are three basic types of text. There are narrative text, descriptive text, and procedural text. And most texts have a combination of two or three. So again, we had a way of measuring for any particular text whether it was primarily procedural or primarily descriptive. We did not look at narrative, and narrative texts tend not to be found in encyclopedias. So we finished up with one complex and one simple, one procedural and one descriptive. We also gave all the children spatial ability tests because we thought maybe spatial ability is going to be a factor, perhaps in using the interface and more probably in using or drawing from the animation. We began the work. We did a certain amount of work on the retrieval side. We found that the more complex a question was in terms of the numbers of concepts embedded within the question, the more problems the students had in finding, and the slower they were in finding the answer. But we spent actually more time on the animation side. At a certain point in the working through, we changed our methodology a little bit. We began by having each child come out from the class, come to a room where we'd set up the encyclopedias, the computers, and we had the kid do one of the, whichever condition they were in, one of the five, we had them do that in a given time, and then we asked the child to recall in his or her own writing what had just been assimilated. And we tried to choose articles that were completely removed from the curriculum that the children were likely to know little or nothing about. So we asked them to write down, and then we had a way of scoring their recall, which again was separate from their ability to write English. So it was looking again at semantic units embedded in the text that they had written down. We also, secondly, asked them to answer 20 multiple choice questions. And then at a certain point we decided maybe doing it this way, maybe trying to measure whether animation had any additional or positive or negative effect on recall, but measuring that in terms of written ability, in terms of writing, was not the best way of doing it, or certainly not the only way we should do it. So we decided that we would build some models and have the children replicate what they had seen. And so we had a replication as well as a written recall test. We also found that some of the animation sequences had little or nothing to do with the text. I mean, I think that Compton's had taken the printed encyclopedia, they'd put it on CD-ROM, and then they'd quickly looked around for any animation they could stick on in some articles to add that dimension. So we found that we actually had to produce our own animation, or certainly enhance the animation that was available on Compton's, to make it slot in with the content of the text. So we did all this. We were successful in a sense. We had findings. We were certainly pretty successful in terms of publishing. We published, I think, 3 JASIS articles, IPM articles in other journals. We gave quite a lot of conference presentations. We found that there was no interference, that the children who had to find the information on the CD-ROM versus ones who just read an encyclopedia. It didn't make any difference to their ability to recall or not recall the text. We found that both complexity and text type did have an effect, that animation worked better with more complex text, and it worked more effectively with the procedural text than the descriptive text. Although we found that it wasn't quite as simple as that, and that whether children benefited from the animation in terms of recall also depended upon their spatial ability. And in a way we were slightly surprised. I mean, I thought that we would find that the kids with the weakest spatial ability would benefit most from seeing the animation, but we didn't find that. We found that the kids with the best spatial ability, the highest scores in the spatial ability test, benefited the most from the animation. And kids with low spatial ability scores, actually the animation had a negative effect on them. So it was a fun project. You know, we worked together. It was multidisciplinary with Alain as well as Jamshid and myself. We found out quite a lot of what children did in these circumstances, and we found out how they did it, but we didn't find out why. Didn't really know why these things were happening. And I mean, it's interesting looking back now. I mean, even looking back at the end of the project, I mean, it was fairly obvious why we didn't really know, why we couldn't answer that question. It's because we never spoke to the children. We actually, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense for the children or even for us, but we treated them rather like scientists treat mice. I mean, we took a group of children and we put them in a particular setting and said, okay, now do this, and we watched what they did, and then we sent them back again. We never talked to them. We certainly never talked to the teachers. So we didn't really know why this was happening. But of course, we could have changed our methodology, and we could have continued working in this area. But by the end of this project, I was beginning to wonder whether this is the direction I ought to be going in. I think 20 years ago, the disciplinary boundaries around what we now call information science were perhaps less fluid than they are now, perhaps more rigid. And I felt that we were leaving behind information science and leaving behind my primary interest in interface design to head into this area of learning. And so we decided, despite our success in publishing in this field, and by the way, you know, we were pretty successful, but no one read these articles. I mean, I look back up now on them, and I still think, you know, they're not bad articles. You look at the citations of them, you find almost no citations. Because people in the IS field were not interested in reading about this kind of thing. And people who were in, I mean, there wasn't a lot of work going on. There's some work going on in psychology. They didn't read IS journals in those days, for sure they didn't. Yeah, so I felt, you know, I've never been too career-oriented, but I thought maybe this is, you know, not a good thing. Maybe we should shift direction. So we did. Alain decided he wanted to stay with us, so we had the same group of the three of us. We decided that we would now change a few things. We would try working with children in a realistic environment, because this has been quite artificial. We decided we'd actually go in a classroom, we'd actually encounter teachers. It was not a totally straightforward thing to do. I mean, I realized once we started doing this, that now we encountered new problems, because our original plan had been to work in a number of schools again, a number of classrooms, but we wanted all the schools that we worked in to have their kids doing the same project. And we found that although Quebec has a curriculum, the demands of the curriculum are at a fairly high level. So they don't actually specify you do this project this semester and this project this next semester. And we couldn't get any agreement. I mean, we spent quite a lot of time meeting with the teachers, and we couldn't get any agreement on one project that we'd all do. So in the end, we said, okay, we'll work in one school. So we worked in one school. We stayed with grade 6, 2 teachers, and we still had issues in getting the project sorted out. But eventually, they agreed that they were going to have a project on the Middle Ages. Yeah? And for the Middle Ages, we were able to identify 3 CD-ROMs which had 3 different kinds of interfaces, which is what we were interested in. We had a CD-ROM with a rather traditional interface, which fundamentally presented with all, of course, the retrieval bells and whistles, but fundamentally presented the same information as a print encyclopedia. And then at the other extreme, we had a very interactive, manipulative interface that allowed children to walk around and open doors and go in rooms and so on. And then we had a third interface that was intermediate. We put the computers in the classroom. So we put 3 computers in the classroom. And we left them there for the duration of the project. So the first project has been just one-off. There's no opportunity for learning, either positively or negatively, in terms of using CD-ROMs. So in this second project, we were there for several weeks. The children worked in small groups, which is how they actually worked in the classroom, not how we'd had them perform. And we collected the data. We captured on screen everything that was going on when they were using the CD-ROMs, and we captured their voice-overs as they were doing it. We had research assistants observing, not all the time, but going in from time to time and observing the students actually doing this work. The objective for the students was to build a model for the teacher and a written assignment, so we examined them. And we also had the children complete a questionnaire after the event to try to capture their thinking of what's gone on. But we failed once again to interview them. I mean, this time we had no time to do this. We found we were heading into the end of the academic year, and the teachers said, you know, these children now go on visits and have other things to do, and so we were not able individually to interview the children. We found some things. We found that from a navigational point of view, in terms of manipulating an interface, using an interface, the children were impressive. I mean, we've always found that they were impressive in that respect. But in terms of information retrieval skills, they were not. They were not impressive. They were not inventive in their thinking. I mean, I remember one of the very obvious things that they found difficult to do was to express a concept using terminology other than the one the teacher had given them in the first place. So they were not able to try to match concepts with vocabulary that might then be found in the CD-ROM. There was no learning curve. We were interested this time in seeing whether their behavior from an IR point of view changed over the duration of the project. We found that they fundamentally didn't. If they could do something at the beginning, they could do it at the end, and if they could not do it at the beginning, they tended not to do it at the end. It was a sense of information retrieval not being intuitive, not something you kind of pick up. We also found, however, that they were quite sophisticated in other respects, and they were certainly sophisticated in the sense of being able to distinguish between an interface that was really good fun to use and they liked using, and an interface that was effective for the task in hand. And the two in this particular project were not the same. So they found that the very interactive interface where they could move around and open doors and so on, it was fun to use, but it was not particularly effective in answering the questions that the teachers had set them in the assignment, because the teachers wanted factual information, and the best way to do that was to use a traditional interface. We also, of course, realized that, therefore, maybe there is a relationship between an interface and an assignment, that it's not enough to say that, you know, an interface works or it doesn't work. It depends on what it's being used for. And we realized that if the teachers had maybe been a little more, not adventurous, but had broken out of the traditional kind of assignments, because this was a traditional assignment, and they'd assigned a different task to the students, then maybe a different interface would have actually been the one that worked. So, for example, I think we said in one of the articles, had the task been to write a play about life in a medieval castle, then I think a different interface would have been found to be the most effective. So the children related the interface to the task in hand. By the time we'd finished this project, the world of information technology was on the move, was changing. And schools were beginning to set up computers in labs and beginning to have children use the web. So we installed, for 2 grade 6 classes, they shared a classroom for this particular topic, and we installed computers into the classroom. And we put telephone lines, because this is still in the day when you had to begin your move onto the internet via telephone lines. So we had telephone lines fitted in school. We worked with a teacher who was the first time we had a teacher who seemed at all interested in what we were doing, and he was interested in the kids doing a project on the Winter Olympics, which has recently been finished in Japan, in Nagano. So the project that he set was for the kids in their groups, because they again formed small teams, 2 or 3 students. They had to each select one winter sport. They didn't have to all choose the same sport, but the kids in any one group chose the same sport and had to find out certain things about the sport. And they had to produce a 2-dimensional poster, and they had to make a class presentation. And we were interested in looking at whether what kinds of sources they used and how they used them. So in this project, unlike the previous one, they were not, the students were not asked to only use, in this case, the web. In previous ones, they were only asked to use CD-ROM. In this project on the web, they could use whatever they wanted. They could use magazine articles, they could ask people, and they could use the web when and if they wanted to use it. It was there in the classroom to be used. This school had a computer lab with a few computers in it, but basically the students did not use computers, and they were not integrated into classroom activities till we came along. We found that the moving images, they were not so much animation as short film extracts now, were not considered very important by the students. They were interesting for them to watch, but of course again it was difficult to incorporate information you gather from watching a short extract of film into a 2-dimensional poster and a talk. So again, there was a bit of a mismatch there. We found again that they were able to navigate from a technical point of view the web. They could cut and paste, for example, without any great difficulty. But again, they had a lot of retrieval problems. We did interview every student and every teacher. I think we wrote an article about, based just on the interviews. And we found that the children at this stage, which was the end of the 1990s, late 1990s, could be divided roughly into 3 categories. There were the kids who I called technophiles, who were very gung-ho on IT, very good at gung-ho on the web, and thought this is the thing to use. And then we found other students who we called traditionalists, who were not like that. There were a small number of them, but the traditionalists still very much favoured magazine articles and were somewhat leery about the web and using it. And then we found the kids in the middle, we called pragmatists, who said, well, we use whichever is the best for any particular subtask that we have to do. So we're not committed either to the technology or to the traditional print approach. We use both when necessity calls for it. So we did this project, and we concluded from it that maybe we need to think a little bit about designing portals for children. The children here, Google didn't exist when we did this project. I believe it was Alta Vista. They were all very gung-ho on Alta Vista. And, they could make sense of Alta Vista. One of the main problems they had was that they found when they did their searches anything on the web that matched the search needs. So it was like throwing them into the Library of Congress instead of a children's library. It was like giving them material that was written for research scientists as well as small children. I mean, they found whatever was out there. And we could see that they had real difficulties with that. And we thought maybe we should look at the possibility, in the same way that children's books had been written since, I think, the 17th century, that we should think of targeting children with resources that are suitable for them. And our idea then was to take a look at some of the children's portals that were out there and not being used very much, as well as some adult portals, and try to identify some design characteristics. In fact, we were quite interested in, we wrote an article, it never went beyond being theoretical, but we wrote an article about setting up a matrix which would allow you to input various things about the users. We were quite interested at that time in gender and age and the subject matter and so on. and then it would punch out a set of characteristics that the portal should have that you were going to design. So we thought that might be interesting to do. And then we were in a meeting, Jamshid and myself, Alan had gone by then, and we had two very bright master's students working with us at that time. And we thought, well, what about letting children do the evaluation instead of us? Instead of us going out and looking at these different portals, why don't we get some children? We weren't sure whether this would work, but we were at the end of this Winter Olympics project. We had a bit of money left, and I thought, well, we'll give it a shot, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. I mean, we just use the last money we have at the end of it. So we we set up 4 focus groups, and we said we'll let the children speak. And we had found some gender effects at that time, so we had 2 groups of boys and 2 groups of girls, and we chose some questions for them to answer, and we chose the questions from a website which collected information about children's homework assignments. Children could send in their homework questions, and people would try to help them to answer them. So, so we had some real questions for the age group we were interested in. We used a slightly bigger range of children, and we asked the children to use the portals to try to answer these questions, and to talk to us as they did so, and to tell us what did they like and what didn't they like, and what suggestions did they have. And so we see how this goes. And we were amazed. I mean, amazed at how effectively children could do this. They were quite capable of discussing in an intelligent way the portals that we put before them, and to tell us the kinds of things they liked and the kinds of things they didn't. And I think we wrote an article based on this bit of the work. So we concluded, children can formulate ideas and can communicate ideas which are worthwhile. So now we should apply for a new grant. So we applied for a new grant in the area of user-centered design. User-centered design by now, this is the early 2000s, was quite well accepted when the users were adults, but it was more controversial when the users were children, and it was also controversial when you discuss the extent and the way in which the users, in this case children, should be involved in the design. But we knew that at University of Maryland, Allison was doing work in this area, and we thought we'd give this a shot. This is when Ms. Nessett, Dr. Nessett, Professor Nessett, Val Nessett came in. She was one of the research assistants on this project, and we created 2 design teams. We stuck with again with our grade 6 children. We had 3 adults, myself, Val, and Leanne, another doctoral student I had at that time. And we also thought, what happens if we work with even younger children, which we'd never done before? So we dropped down to grade 3. These kids were 8 and 9 years old. And we worked with them, and after the event, we gave a name to the method we had used. We called it bonded design. And we basically put into the research team the adult designers with the users, and the users brought their children's perspective to the task, and we had a series of techniques that we used, not necessarily sequentially, a series of techniques we used. And the objective was to design a low-tech prototype. So again, we weren't sure what would happen, would this work? The children were all Google users. They were all sold on Google, particularly the grade 6 kids. And they came up with a couple of portals. So this was a grade 6 design. And I don't have time. This is just the opening screen from the grade 6 portal, the English version, because they wanted to build a bilingual version. We don't have time to talk about it, except to make 2 points. First of all, it doesn't look anything like Google. There's a tiny bit of Google in it, but basically it doesn't really look like Google. And secondly, that they were very keen to have, as well as keyword searching, question searching, which we could never actually implement properly, they were keen to have a subject index. So I'm going to come back to that in a later project. So we're keen to have a subject index. So that was a grade 6, and this is a grade 3 portal. And again, it doesn't look like Google. And this was the kids' design, it wasn't ours. So we had these 2 low-tech portals. The next task was to build them, to make them work on the web. So we built the 2 portals. And in order to make them work, we needed a database. We needed to send robots out on the web to collect sites. So we didn't have robots, but we had graduate students. Not as good as robots, maybe not as bright as robots, but we had graduate students. So we sent them out on the web, and we said, find articles about Canadian history, because we decided at the outset the only way in a research project we could conceivably do this was to narrow the focus from the whole universe of knowledge down to, for several, again, pragmatic reasons, we chose Canadian history. So they went out on the web, and they looked for websites in English or in French relating to Canadian history, and that were, again, approximately considered appropriate in reading level for children in elementary school. And we spent quite a bit of time doing this. I mean, the portal construction was quite fast. Setting the rest of it up was much slower. We found about 2,500 websites, somewhat over half in English and somewhat under half in French. We also had to have we wanted a hierarchical subject index to link these sites to so they could do that part of the searching, and we found there was nothing we could use in the world of, we couldn't find anything that was suitable for children and detailed enough on Canadian history. So we had to build our own, which we hadn't planned to do. So we built our own taxonomy, and then of course we had to index all the websites against the taxonomy. So we did that, and then we wanted to evaluate them. We said, okay, we've got these two portals, we've built them, they work, they're on the web, they're password protected, but they're on the web. What are other children who had nothing to do with the design and don't actually know that children were involved in the design, what do they make of them? So we had two ways of doing that. Again, we set up focus groups in both English schools and French schools for the English interface and French interface, the English sites and French sites. And we gave the children questions to answer, and again we got them to talk about it and how did they find the experience, what did they like, what didn't they like. And then we also, in the English schools, we actually put computers in the classroom and had the kids, over the duration of a class project on Canadian history, use the portals. And we found that both portals performed well. I mean, I know I'm going to want to say that, but the children liked them. They liked History Trek marginally more than Kids Cite Canada, so they liked the portal that came from the team with the grade 6 kids in, slightly better than the one with the grade 3. And the only real criticism we had was obviously the relatively small number of sites in total, but more particularly the small number of sites that could be retrieved on any particular search. So that was a bit of a limitation. We decided to take History Trek and launch it in a full-blown version on the web. So we removed the password control and said anybody can use History Trek, and it's still available. I mean, you can look it up now. It's still working on the web. We publicized it. I got another grant to publicize History Trek. It was a grant to try to take the results of research work into the real world. So we got money for this, and I visited 12 of the 13 ministers of education. Every province and territory in Canada has one. For me, England is a crazy system, but they have these 13 ministers. So I went to 12 of them, and we made presentations, sometimes to an individual, sometimes to a group. I remember we came to Edmonton, Heidi. So we talked about the portal and what it could do, because we felt this was a way of, via these ministries, of percolating down to schools. We couldn't visit every elementary school in Canada, so we did this. And it's still available. History Tech is still working. I don't have recent figures, but I mean, we did an article back in 2010, and between September 2007 and January 2010, so it's 8, 9, so that's just a little over 2 years, we had over 800,000 hits. Now, what does that mean? Well, what does it mean? I mean, we had originally intended to track what people did, but we've never actually done that. So, I mean, we don't know what people did. We don't know who they were, of course. We have no idea if they were children, but at least it was being used and still is being used. However, we're also, now I'm an Emeritus professor, of course I don't have to plug myself so much. So I can admit that we still don't have quite as many hits as Google. I mean, Google still rules despite our building History Trek. While all this was going on, while this project was going on, an IT company in Montreal contacted me. We had a common acquaintance. They had done work and still well, they don't exist anymore, but they were doing work with a professor, not Alain Breleux, but another professor in educational psychology at McGill, who knew the kind of work I was doing. And she said to the company called National-Pratt-Grinstad, you should get in touch with Andy Large. The company was primarily interested in training programs for commercial customers using virtual reality. So they were always keen to get new grants, and so they could see opportunities in the educational sector, not the training sector. So they contacted me. I went down there with Jamshid, and when we got there, we found a third guy from McGill called Kevin Key, who has since moved on to Brock. But he was a joint appointment between education and history, and was interested in what I guess now would be called digital humanities. So we all got on well together, and we kicked around quite a lot of ideas with Virtualage. I mean, one idea was to build in virtual reality a street in Montreal called Saint Laurent. And Saint Laurent is famous in Montreal for being the street that welcomed waves of immigrants. So different waves of immigrants would move into Montreal and settle in Saint Laurent, and then begin to move out, and another wave would come in. So the idea was to build Saint Laurent over several time periods, and then children could walk around in Saint Laurent. They could see what was being sold. They could see how much things cost. They get a sense of life in the street. But in the end, we decided maybe that was a bit too complicated, so we hit on the idea of taking a painting. So we wanted to take a painting and then, through virtual reality, allow the children to walk into the painting and walk around the painting and explore what the painting was showing. So we wrote the grant, and we then wrote had to do a bigger proposal, and we got the money. So we got a lot of money, but not much time. We've got 1 year. We were used to working with 3-year grants that could be renewed for 1 year. Now we had a 1-year grant that could not be renewed. And to make it worse, we had a dispute with McGill over the money. McGill charges research overheads to any research team that gets money from anyone other than an organization whose primary task is to fund research. So we got this money from Heritage Canada, whose primary task is to publicize Canadian culture. It's not to give grants, but they gave grants. So McGill said we want 20% overhead, and Heritage Canada had already told us we don't pay overhead. So it was quite it might sound a simple thing to solve. Jamshid handled it, not me. But it was quite a battle with McGill. And in the end, Jamshid said, okay, if you want to do the grant, we're not paying an overhead. If you want an overhead, forget it, we won't do it. And so McGill backed down. Yeah, Beheshti won, McGill nil. However, in the meantime, Virtualage, which was, worked from project to project, had started building. Unbeknownst to us, they'd already started building. We worked primarily with 2 programmers. One built the people who were going to be in the virtual world, and the other one built the world. The guy who built the world was Mexican. And when we went along they said, come and see what he's been doing. We went along to it, and we had chosen, actually in the end it wasn't a painting. Again, none of us are art experts. So Kevin thought he'd chosen a painting, and it turned out to be an illustration from a late 19th century book. So it was actually a book illustration. So then we had issues of family who owned it. I know the copyright had expired, but there were issues over that. But we solved those, and we had this painting, and it was set in a village called Sainte-Hélène, which is just south of Montreal, at the end of the 19th century. And it was a novel written by quite a famous person, not necessarily a famous author, but a famous person who was quite a political figure in Quebec at the time, in French book, describing life in this village and what happened to the various characters. So we went to look at the design that was well underway at Virtualage and found it looked more like the kind of, have you seen The Magnificent Seven? I mean, it looked like a Mexican village. You got the time period right. It was the 19th century, but it didn't look anything like even I thought Sainte-Hélène should look. So you might say, oh, that's not a big deal, but I mean, it is a big deal because he'd spent a lot of time doing this, and now we had to try to get him to undo it. And we finished up with a village that looked not so much like Magnificent Seven, but it didn't really look like Sainte-Hélène either. So it was a compromise. We built this enormous research team. We had Dr. Nesset floating around, and we had a few students from information science. We had a lot of doctoral students from history from UQAM, another university in Montreal. We had teachers, because we were conscious of the fact that often these kinds of projects fail because you don't produce what teachers want. So we had teachers as consultants. They produced work plans. We had an artist, because we had web links, and we had drawings that the artists put on. We had actors, because the people in the virtual reality had to talk. And one of the requirements of the project was it had to be bilingual. So we had to have a French version as well as an English version. So we had actors. We had a dance troupe, because at one point there was a dance in the village. It was a Thanksgiving, or and it was hard to do it in virtual reality. So we actually filmed a real dance troupe with musicians, and then built that into the virtual reality world. So it was interesting. So we did a lot of things. It was fun. It was development, not research. I mean, we'd been told by the funders that this was not a research project. I mean, the objective was to produce something that would work at the end of 1 year. And we had problems. The other objective that the project had to meet was it had to be accessible over the web. So we had to produce a virtual reality world that we could deliver to schools over the web. And we couldn't do it. We started off by compromising and, if you like, sort of dumbing down particularly the figures. We could make quite sophisticated people who looked, reasonably realistic and moved in quite a sophisticated way, as long as there were lots and lots and lots of points of manipulation of the figures. But that made the bandwidth that was needed to carry that was enormous. So then we had to start stripping down these people, which reduced the bandwidth, but then they began to look more like cartoon figures, which is not really what we wanted. And we finished up in the end with neither one thing nor the other. I mean, we finished up with a project that we finished up with a product that was that had a lower bandwidth requirements that we started with, but that still was almost impossible for any school to access. I mean, even we had a lot of difficulties. I'm not showing anything of it here. I mean, we always had problems with it. You had to download additional software to run it. So in the end, we spent a lot of money, quite a lot of time. We learned by the hard way, by making mistakes, how to do some of this stuff. It was not a research project. We did almost no evaluation because Heritage Canada weren't particularly interested in that. And to be honest, we were not interested in doing things that we couldn't get money for. So, I mean, we did a tiny bit of evaluation. I mean, a tiny, tiny bit of evaluation. We tried to get another project from Heritage Canada, collaborating with Virtualage. We felt that we could cash in on some of the mistakes we'd made the first time around. I mean, we felt we'd learned something. Now we could go for it again. And again, we got through to the very final stages of the competition, and we didn't get the money. And I'm sure we didn't get the money, maybe rightly so, because at the end of the day, we'd failed to deliver a usable product the first time around, and that was the task we were given. We told them we could do it, and in fact, in the end, we couldn't. So we didn't get the money. And we actually did try again a little bit later, a couple of years later. We applied for another grant to try to take what we'd done with the Virtualage and this virtual reality product and to evaluate it. And again, it was a sort of neither one thing nor the other. We'd already developed it, and we didn't get the money. So it came to a bit of a dead end, which was a shame in a way. But we learned something from it. I learned again that collaboration with companies is not quite like doing the research on your own, and doing a development project is not quite the same. And although I'd done quite a few quite big development projects in Wales before I came to Canada, this was a sort of a different ballpark for us. But Jamshid he wasn't very taken with Virtualage, I can tell you, but he was quite taken with the idea of virtual environments. And he'd done a little bit of work on his own, because I said, I'm not very interested in it, back in the 90s. So he was quite keen to try to facilitate browsing by building virtual environments. And we got money. This was the only project where he was the principal investigator and I was a co-investigator on this one I'm now talking about. So he got the money to build a virtual environment to support browsing. And one of the problems in doing this kind of work on a research grant is that you spend so much time and money building in order to do the research. I mean, you can't do the research till you've built the environment, and it proved to be a long and slow task. This is just a still screenshot of what was built. So in the end, it looked a little bit like a children's library. Some of the earlier versions looked absolutely nothing like a children's library. But this one looked a little bit like a children's library. And you could walk around it, and there were different rooms, and there were bookshelves, and on the shelves of books, and they're arranged but in the same sequence as our subject indexing of the websites and history track. And in fact, they're not actually books, they're websites, looking like books. And you could search using the computer on the desk. There were several computers scattered around. And we wanted to see whether children using this kind of retrieval device would find items of interest to them that they hadn't initially searched for. Well, sorry, I'll come on to that in a second. So we, again, we did very little evaluation. We did some tests as we were developing the product, the entity, but very little evaluation because we ran out of time and money. So again, it was not a terribly effective project for us. But what it did seem to reveal, I suppose, was some of my worst suspicions that although children liked it again, it was fun to play with, it was fun to use, it didn't seem, in fact, to work any better. Perhaps it worked worse than a traditional way of finding information, traditional search, keyword search method. But I thought we'll give one more go in the visual world, because we'd seen with History Track how children could use this structured hierarchical subject index as well as keyword searching. And I found that, when we talked to the kids and watched what they did, that they actually preferred to use a subject index. But they only preferred to use a subject index when it seemed fairly obvious to them how to enter into it. So you have to enter in at the top level. If it seemed fairly clear to them at which top level to enter to find any subject heading that was lower down the hierarchy, they would do so. But if it wasn't clear to them, they would default to keyword searching. So I thought, well, maybe information visualization is a technique that has been tried out. Maybe we can use information visualization with children to capitalize on its visual elements and to kind of open out a taxonomy, to make it more straightforward to identify terms in the taxonomy. So we gave that a shot, and we started off with a bonded design team again. Val was again involved, and it was almost the point at which she left. She came to Buffalo. Buffalo took her, but it was, I think, the last thing she worked on with us. And we had a team, and it was a little bit more complicated than the first bonded design teams with History Track, because the kids didn't know anything about visualization, and they didn't know anything about taxonomies, and they didn't know anything about indexing. So it was a bigger task to get them up to speed with the kinds of things we wanted them to do. But they came up with design ideas, and we eventually built two models, one based on their idea and one not based on their idea. We used the term set from History Track, about 1,400 terms from the English version. We used the same index we had with History Track, which has 8 levels, at the top level, 8 divisions, and goes down in breadth down to, into depth down to 4 levels. And we got some ideas from them. So we then built these visualizations. So this was the non-information visualization. This is just the top level of a traditional hierarchical index. So you would click on places, and then you get the next level down, and the next level down would be all kinds of places, and you would click on that, and you go to further down into more detailed places and so on. It worked in a traditional kind of way. So that was a search. with that particular taxonomy. So this was the first of the visualization ones. It was based to some extent on the children's work in bonded design. There's also a fairly common, radial layout is fairly common in information visualization work. So this is the top level, and you see the eight levels here, but you also see within each circle you get a kind of schematic of the structure below that. But you still, of course, have to choose. I mean, the problem was you still have to choose a top level. Okay. When you choose one of these, you go down to the next level. So if you choose places, we now see more detail here. We see the second level in the taxonomy, and we see the third level in the taxonomy. So we have it opened out more. But we still don't see the fourth level until the children move the cursor around. And each one of these little dots represents level 4. And as the kids move the cursor around the circle, they pop out and pop in again. Yeah, so as you move this thing around, you see this fourth level. So it kind of opens it up. So that was one of the visualizations. And then we had a doctoral student, Charles-Antoine Julien, who's now an assistant professor in school, but then he was a doctoral student. And he was building a visualization of a part of McGill's OPAC, part of McGill's subject index. So we thought we'll have a shot at using his ideas. So it's another fairly common, very common technique in information visualization to use a cone tree structure. So in this one, we have the 8 top levels here, and you can rotate the whole visualization, and you can also zoom in and out of this one. So we we tried out these two. We went back to experimental, except we did interview the kids. So we had 13 students in the first experiment where we compared list with circles. So we had them look for information using lists and using circles. We timed them and so on. And in the second experiment, we had 14 students. Again, these are grade 6 students. And this time it was list compared with cones. And the measures were the success or failure at finding the term, how long it took them to find the term, and then what were their reactions? What did they think about the whole experience? And we had time limits. And by the way, this is for the first time ever, we did the same thing with adults, with MLIS students. We got them to do the same procedure. Well, we found that, as is often the case in work that's done with information visualization, the most successful way of finding the term was with a traditional list. It wasn't with either of the other two. The cone was slightly more successful than circles. With all the interfaces, whichever one of the 3 was used, it was always harder to locate terms at level 4 than level 3, and the further we went down the hierarchy. In terms of speed, list again was the fastest, and then circles and cone. But to be fair to the visualizations, we couldn't find an overall significant effect for list. But still, I mean, when you eyeballed the figures, list did better. We found the usual story. A majority of the students liked the visualizations. They were fun to use, as we found through all these projects. But list was easiest to use and seemingly perhaps the most effective. So overall, neither circles nor cone demonstrated any significant superiority to conventional equivalent. But we could see that both the designs had inherent problems. I mean, circles, for example, it was quite difficult as you spun the cursor around the circle and you hit the little red dots. You had to be absolutely perfectly located to click on the dot, and that's when the timing kicked in and said how long. So if a child was slightly less dexterous and couldn't quite get the spot, the clock was ticking on. I mean, it was a weakness. It's just one example of a weakness in the design. So we decided that we would take circles, which appeared overall to have been slightly better than cones, and see if we could improve it, see if we could make it work more effectively. And here the kind of real life, I suppose, entered our rarefied research environment. I went over to be associate dean, and I also knew that my days at McGill were beginning to run out. I suppose I had less time to devote. Jamshid was quite keen on switching to working with somewhat older children in a different kind of context. So we applied for another grant this time again with him as principal, me as co-investigator, to work with high school students, secondary school students, to try to build some kind of virtual intervention to help them better do school projects. So we now, had a different distraction. The money and time were running out on this one. And we did some work. We did actually quite a bit of work on circles, but we never finished it, and we never tried it out. So when the first day I was teaching in Wales in 1978, I was sent on a course in the Faculty of Education on how to be a good lecturer. And one of the things they told us was never be negative about your work, because if you're negative, for sure the students will be negative. So after all these years, I've broken this rule. I mean, in a way, I'm finishing on a slightly negative note, because this was a project we never absolutely brought to completion. Well, we had some interesting results, and we had a few publications. So I asked myself at the end of all this, and I see it's 4 o'clock, but I think I started just a little bit late. So what? I mean, so what, if anything, have I learned? At least what have I learned? I don't know what anyone else has learned, but what have I learned from these various projects? I think perhaps the most valuable thing I've learned is that children do have ideas, and children should be involved. And maybe it's obvious, I mean, maybe it was bizarre that when we first began that we didn't ask children, but I'm not sure anyone else did either. That children are not just there to be manipulated and given instructions and then observed. That they have ideas, and they have positive ideas that can contribute. We also found over this whole experience that children are attracted by novel interfaces, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance. I mean, that produces engagement, and particularly with children, engagement matters. So that an attractive interface may not, by the normal evaluation standards of, say, IR, work better, but if it engages the children well, that has to be taken into account. I think we have demonstrated that moving images can be powerful in education contexts, but only under certain circumstances, and they can be problematical to transfer to the real world in a way that enables them to be used effectively. I think we found that IT tools should be aligned with educational objectives. So we can't have one without the other. Whether an IT tool works depends on what it's supposed to be doing, in part. I think we found, although we've never had any real interest in it, I think Professor Julian is maybe more interested in it than we are, I think students and teachers perhaps do need information literacy training. I mean, we've always taken, in a way, the opposite route and said, okay, let's try to make things easier for them to use. Let's try to simplify the world for them. And the alternative, though they don't have to be either or, the alternative is to say, they're going to have to face these tools. Why don't we train them how to use them? Why are we wasting all this money producing technologies for children when we should be devoting the time to increasing the information literacy of the students, and for sure the teachers? It's some disappointment, maybe not a lot of surprise, that no major web service provider has opted for a children's portal. Okay, Yahoo did produce Yahooligans, but I mean, it was always a bit half-hearted. We actually approached Google about 2 years ago. We went to Google with the idea for a research project, and we said we'd like to take your search engine as it works now. We would like to use your ranking algorithms. We would like children to be able to do a search, and they get a series of hits as anyone else would. But then we would like to superimpose upon that a second level, where we take the top X, that we would have to determine what X was, to take the top X ranked sites, and we now run some more algorithms against them to try to identify which ones are appropriate for children, and then do another ranking, so that we are trying to produce for the children sites which are more accessible in terms of content and syntax and so on, structure, and more appropriate for children. And Google were not interested. Alison Julian had told me she also has had discussions with Google, and I mean, it came down to the same result, that Google was not interested. I suppose if children are using Google, why fix it? And then the final comment I'd like to make. So I am ending on a positive comment at the very end. I think children do deserve attention from the information science community. And certainly when we began this kind of work, they got almost no attention. We were not the first people to work with children in our field, but there were very, very few people. They are, it's obvious to say, but I mean the children today are the adults of tomorrow. They are tomorrow's users. It's always a bit disappointing when we go to conferences and we speak in sessions which have been put together around the children's theme rather than a thematic session, and we find that a lot of the audience walk out as soon as the children come on the scene. I mean, look at my audience today. This is fairly difficult. It's still difficult, from our perspective, difficult to persuade adults that they should have any real interest in this kind of work. But why it's a positive note is I think it is changing. I think more people are involved now than ever before. When we started working, almost no one in education, for example, was interested in technologies in the classroom. There was very, very little written anyway. And that has changed. I mean, now we see a lot of articles coming from for example, the educational sector. So I think that children have captured more attention than they used to do, and they have captured more attention from the IS community, and that's a positive thing, and that's therefore a good time for me to come to an end. Thanks very much.
Are there any questions?
You've got more questions.
More questions, yeah.
We met for about 7 hours.
First, I want to say that you should quickly write the spec script for the Magnificent Seven in Quebec. And I think that's a movie that's going to earn a lot of money. Second thing, one thing about the design process is that I know that there's a lot of both educational potential. It's an educative process, particularly the iterative aspect of design, but it also just helps simply improve the design. And I'm curious, by having children participate in the design, how much of that was actually explicitly iterative, right? In other words, how much of it was them involved in the design process, but then also seeing their design, their influence on the design in action, and then revisiting the improvement.
So that did happen. Of course, their involvement, I mean, let me just step back a second and be negative and then be positive. So from the kids' point of view, I think there was a real level of disappointment that they were not going to be involved in building the working portal. We made it clear to them that, and that was for a variety of reasons, including logistical problems at our end, that the children would only produce the low-tech portal, so they would only produce that design, and that was a bit disappointing to them. And that's something that Alison Druin has been able to do. We were not able to do. She has been able to involve children more. However, in terms of developing a non-operational portal, there was an iterative aspect to it. We started off talking to them about various design ideas. They produced designs. We talked about them. We discussed them. We went back and they produced a different design. The design moved forward. We ultimately sent off the design ideas to graphic artists, and we had the graphic artists come up with a design that we took back to the children, had them look at it and review it and suggest changes, and then finally we built an operational portal. So there was an iterative backwards and forwards between the designs that were emerging and the design team, not just the children, but I mean the team as a whole. It was an iterative process.
And also with the taxonomy, the separate one where we had the kids doing the indexing with indexing cards and things like that, so that and not just testing, but actually involved in how things would look. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but where, as you said, where we ran into problems was the fact that we just didn't have the computing expertise right there. Alison Druin, who's mentioned at University of Maryland, they have a design, she's had design
start with
team.
her husband is a leading figure in the computer science.
Exactly.
They have HI labs there. They have lots of computers. The kids come in. They make design suggestions, and then Alison's husband and his team make the changes. So
Right there.
A couple of days later, the children can see those changes and react to them. And we were not able to do that. I mean, we didn't have those kinds of computing resources, either technological or human, that would allow us to do that.
I've got a question about the relative efficiency of the list, the circle, and the cone approaches. Do you think that the benefits of the list, regardless of the issues with the others, do you think the benefits of the list result from familiarity or from some sort of innate cognitive structures that make that a useful way to...
I'm not sure why. I mean, if you ask me why is list was list ultimately more successful, I think part of it is that there was a certain level, not a lot, but a certain level of familiarity with it, whereas there was absolutely no familiarity with circles and so on. And remember, we used a sort of a somewhat similar technique to the one we used back in the early 90s. I mean, each kid came out of the classroom, sat at the computer, did a task, and then went away again. There was no chance to learn. We gave them a very, very brief training. We gave them a whole training session, but I mean, it was a couple of minutes. So I think that it was alien to them. I think, well, I've already said that there were some design problems. Even I found cones. The cones were quite. I mean, it's quite easy to get lost in it, even though from a visualization point of view, it was very, very small data set. Usually they use a big data set. So I think that was part of the problem. I think that also the kids found it faster to use lists, and therefore, again, in a somewhat iterative fashion, they could jump in, make a mistake, go back in again, and it was a faster process. And although we thought, well, maybe cones is going to be quite fast, they can move around and zoom in and out, and the amount of time they would get lost doing this was such that it more than compensated in negative sense for what it could offer. And by the way, I said we did it with adults, and we found almost identical results. I mean, the only difference between the children and the MLIS students, I don't know whether this is MLIS students or not, the only difference is that the MLS students were more determined to find something. So with the children, we had a certain number who failed to find the term in the time period. With the adults, with the MLS students, they all found the term. But if we looked at the kids who found the term versus the MLS students, that is all of them who found the term, then there was almost no difference. We got exactly the same results, which is interesting. I mean, there's been very little work done comparing children and adults, I think, because it's quite hard to come up with a task that can be equally appropriate for a child to do and an adult. But in a way, this one was, because it didn't really make any difference whether they were children or adults. So again, I think that the adults, of course, were more familiar. These are MLI students; they should have some familiarity with the conventional hierarchical etc. But the results are very similar. So it suggests that familiarity might have been one aspect, but wasn't the only one. And I think that just the idea of using visualizations initially is maybe a little bit confusing. Madame.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ji-Won Sun, a mathematics teacher educator. I personally am interested in looking at how to use technology to improve students' mathematical ability. And one of your findings was that students tend not to use animation in completing assignments.
So tend not to use animation?
Yes, animation in doing assignments. And then one of your suggestion is moving image can be powerful in education context. So, yes.
Okay, I don't think I'm contradicting myself. I said one other thing. I said that animation did not appear to be very effective in certain conditions where it was an inappropriate resource given the task. That's the point. That when if the task was one that enabled students to draw upon the visual aspects that could be presented in animation. Let me give you an example. In the very first project we did in 1990, one of the articles was a very strange one in the encyclopedia. It was how to find the direction south using a stick and a piece of string, I think, was all. Yeah? So that was what the article was about. So you could read about that. You could read how how you put the stick in the middle and where you put the string. I just forget how it worked, but you could read how to do it. You can also read how to do it and see a picture, a still shot frozen in time, how to do it. But you could also see the animation. The animation showed it taking place. So we found that with that, in that instance, okay, yes, children with weaker visual skills tended to find the animation perhaps confusing, so it didn't help them. But children who had better visual skills could see much better and learn much better, or certainly could recall much better how to do that task when they had the animation, and if they were allowed to demonstrate this using a model we built that allowed them to demonstrate it. It was more difficult for them to do it if they had to still just write down what they'd seen. When I was in high school, I remember a teacher saying, okay, I want you to write down the instructions of how to tie a shoelace. Try doing it. Try writing instructions for how to tie a shoelace descriptively using, or describe that procedure in writing. It's very, very difficult. You know, you take this lace with the left hand, you twist it over the right hand. If you see a picture, if you see an animation of someone doing it, I was taught to do it because my mother showed me. This is how you tie a lace. You did it X number of times, I learned how to do it. So I think it depends on the context. Animation is not helpful in a context where, to put it simply, it's not helpful in a context where there's very little animation. But I could see, in certain kinds of maths teaching, it would be very useful. But it also appears to depend a little bit on the children and whether they are adept at extracting information from a visual moving representation like in animation, or whether they're not, whether they're more text-oriented. And after all, these kids have spent most of their, they're only in grade 6, but they'd spent their academic life being taught using text. The schools didn't use animation, I don't think then. They were used to learning in a textual context, and maybe there are different techniques you have to learn if you're going to start using animation. And so, because this was just a one-off, it was one chance to use it. That was it. They had 5 minutes to do this. So it's a long answer, but I think that would be my answer. That it isn't black and white. It depends. Yeah.
Have there been tests recently that you've seen of children now and how they respond to animation? I imagine it's very different.
Well, they haven't, because once we left that, putting that 1990s world behind, we never really quite came back to it. Obviously we've used images quite a lot in a variety of ways, but we haven't come back and look at how animation, when attached to text, can increase recall. So it's not a literature I've followed. So I have to say no. Actually, I don't know where things are at with it.
Because it's like kids are so much more adept at using technology.
Different world now from the world of 1990. We got the guys in 1991. I guess we worked since 1994. It's a different world. They are much more used now to visual information. It's true, and maybe the results would be quite different.
Interesting.
My work actually is related to that. Study young children. We talk about 5 to 6 years old, kindergartners. One of the projects we're doing right now is study them how they engage with digital text on iPads. Mm-hmm. So there's some similarity between your first project, the CD-ROM animation things. One of the things we notice if the animation is incongruent with the text. Yes. That's a lot more easier for help the comprehension, the recall. But if the animation is just for the sake of being entertaining, that actually end up being distracting.
And overloading.
Overloading too, exactly.
The more information you give in one way seems good, but it's also increasing volume of information that's being delivered. So if you add that to the fact that the animation is not well linked with text and still images, yes, it begins to have a negative impact. Because they're assimilating information that appears to be contradictory. And then, if on top of that, you did what we did in the first stages of the project, which is to measure what they've learned by asking them to write things down again. You know, it's not surprising that we didn't find bigger effects, but that's so I agree, and it was disappointing to see the kinds of animations that were used. I mean, I think finding yourself with a stick in sand or was one of the better ones, but we also had some instances where the animation really was quite an odd with the text. And I mean, that of course just complicates the life of the children. What did you make of that?
It's just like animation clip art. That's added.
But it's a very interesting point. I mean, young children, they tend to have they start school, they don't really favor text over other things, and they actually prefer other non-text information. But I think the formal schooling made the text privileged over any other information. But right now, their life, I mean, the iPad is everywhere and the iPhone is everywhere. The visual-based technology interface is everywhere. So, and also the school now, the encouragement of multi-literacy, multimodal literacies. So I feel maybe there's a potential change to the text, the traditional text privileged will move towards a more multimodal way of literacy. So we identify the children's learning should be broadened to the repertoire of the modes. So that probably fundamentally going to change the design as well as the information processing, right? Because if they're used to this multimodal of learning expression, the teacher allows them to not just use text to describe how they tie the shoelaces, they could demonstrate, or they can have different ways of doing that. And that's probably going to change the design as well as the information retrieval. So because I don't work from the IS side, I more work from the educational side, I do see those two sides would influence each other. So the future is kind of...
No, I agree. It is a different world. And you see, these children have been now in their 6th year in school. So they were inculcated into primarily text-based work. Where some of the children, for example, in the project we did with the Winter Olympics, and some of the children said, they looked at, it wasn't animation, but there was mainly film there, but they looked at film and it was interesting, but they felt somehow it wasn't as important. They actually said that to us. I mean, they had a real express sense that what really mattered was text. And the film that accompanied it was kind of fluff. It was not even icing on the cake. It was really just there, and it wasn't really the kind of information we should base their projects on. So, I mean, again, that was 15 years ago.
But I found that even with the 3rd graders I worked with, text was real information, visual was not.
I think I'm going to have to bring this to a close, unfortunately. Thank you so much.
I'm Dr. Large.